Biophilia meetup. And I'm Sarah States. I'm the Director of Research and Science Education here at Phipps. If you haven't joined us before, these monthly biophilia meetups are ways for us to learn about the various ways that people connect to nature. We at Phipps believe that as humans, we are nature. We're part of nature. And there are many different ways that people interact with nature through various lenses: food, culture, art, science. And so we use these meetups as an opportunity to learn about these new types of connections. So as a quick reminder, we will not be having our environmental film series in December, but you can join us in January for Seasons, the awe-inspiring and thought-provoking tale of the long and tumultuous shared history that inextricably binds humankind with the natural world. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening. Emily Thyroff's roots originate in the beautiful temperate hardwood forests of Western New York. She completed her BS in biology at James Madison University in Virginia's Appalachian Mountains, researched in Australia's rainforest, worked in Western ecosystems across 8 states, and ventured to wild and wonderful West Virginia. She continued her education by earning a MS degree in forest biology at Purdue University in Indiana. Her MS fieldwork in coastal Georgia involved forest restoration and regeneration of maritime forests. Her roots and shoots are currently growing at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where she studies tropical dry forests. She is in the 3rd year of her PhD program and currently lives and works on Hawaii Island in South Kona. I also want to add that Emily was a Botany in Action Fellow this year, and she was unable to join us in person, but we're very excited to have her here giving a talk at our Biophilia meetup. So Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I am so excited to be here today. I'm just going to try and start sharing my screen. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, I think, does that look good? You can see the full PowerPoint slide. Thanks for the thumbs up. So as Sarah said, my name is Emily. I'm part of the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And that means my work revolves around the restoration of tropical dry forests of Hawaii. Today, I'm going to use a few Hawaiian words throughout this presentation. I'll provide definitions, but if you have any questions about words or pronunciations, I would be happy to answer those. So, e komo mai, welcome virtually to Kealakekua Mountain Reserve. This property has an extensive history. Most recently, it was cleared to graze cattle, but when it was purchased in 2018, so just a few years ago, a conservation easement was placed on the property, and work has quickly commenced to reforest with native plants. This property is situated in an area that's considered tropical dry forest. I want to emphasize that this is just like one small sliver of Hawaii. Hawaii might be a small landmass, but it is so incredibly diverse. Nearly all life zones are present throughout the islands, with the exception of the few life zones that are exclusively boreal or Arctic. Otherwise, there are all sorts of forests. Bogs are present. There's a desert and high alpine ecosystems, and you can keep going on. And then specifically for dry forests, I want to emphasize that this is just like one example of what dry forests can look like in Hawaii. So there's even a range of the dry forests that are present. Every day when I go into the field, I start my day with this oli to set an intention and ask permission to enter the property. We also oli at the beginning of classes and seminars, even presentations. So today I'll start by giving this oli. Olis are a type of Hawaiian chant. On the left is the Hawaiian I will share, whereas on the right is the English like approximate translation. Something to note about the Hawaiian language is that it's layered. So there's many definitions and meanings to words that build depth. For example, aloha. A lot of us know that aloha means hello and goodbye. It also means love, presence of breath, a way of life. And because of those layered meanings, it makes translation a little bit tricky. When I oli to enter the property, I turn off my work truck, stand on my feet, and orientate myself to the forest that I'm going to be entering. This way, like I can really ground myself to the place. And because of how our Zoom life has taken over for like Zoom presentations, we encourage people to find somewhere to connect to the landscape they're currently in. So like for me, I'm gonna be looking outside my window. He aloha no ka aina uluwehi. He aloha no ka aina uluwehi. Vehi ke aloha o na kupuna e. E puna vai ke kau I ka hano. Hano hano vale o Hawaii e ho mai ka mahu popo pono pono mai yuka hikahi e. Aloha e aloha e aloha e. In addition to Oline, to orientate ourselves to where we are virtually visiting, I want to give a little bit more context to the Hawaiian Islands. So that's where we are right now. Specifically, we're on Hawaii Island and on the Kona side, or the west side of the island. Even more specifically, we're on the slopes of Mauna Loa. So Mauna Loa is one of 5 shield volcanoes that make up Hawaii Island. And that's what is circled in the orange. Mauna means mountain, so Mauna Loa, Mount Loa. The other 4 shield volcanoes are underlined in orange. So we have Hualalai, Kohala, Mauna Kea, and Kilauea. You may have heard of some of these Mauna in the news. For example, Mauna Loa is where the Keeling curve was created. I remember learning about that curve in the context of climate change, and it really helped me understand like the impacts just over time of carbon dioxide accumulation. So you can see the parts per million of carbon dioxide increasing with the years. When I first learned about the Keeling curve, I had very little idea what Mauna Loa was, where it was, but this observatory is at the very top of the summit and collects this data. For our other Mauna that's been in the news is Mauna Kea. Mauna Kea is a little bit taller than Mauna Loa, and there are observatories and telescopes at its summit, and there's a proposal for another telescope that's been very controversial. And most recently, I think, and most likely to be in the news around the world is Kilauea. And Kilauea is currently erupting, and so our island is still growing. Some more island and Hawaii comparisons. Hawaii Island is larger than all the other Hawaiian islands combined, and it's even bigger than the states of Delaware, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. For Mauna Loa comparisons, Mauna Loa is huge. When people visit Hawaii Island, sometimes they don't really understand how large Mauna Loa is. I'm one of those people, like, it's hard to grasp the scale of it because sometimes it just looks like a big rolling hill. But It's one of the tallest and largest mountains in the world because not only is there like 13,000 feet above sea level, but then there's like thousands of feet below sea level connecting it directly to the seafloor. So back to this photo that was at the beginning of the presentation. This is one view from the property I get to work on. We are facing Mauka, and in this case specifically, we're facing towards the mountain of Mauna Loa. And Mauna Loa here is, in all of its glory. I took this photo just a little bit ago, but now there's snow on the summit. So just picture a little bit of like dusting of snow at the top. Often people use the term Mauka and its complement Makai, meaning towards the ocean. So Mauka's to the Mauka's towards the mountains, Makai is towards the ocean, to provide directions rather than like north, south, east, west. And I think it's really telling that this is how people day-to-day orient themselves. And it's with relation to the natural world with the mountains and the ocean. And to the left of this photo, we can also see the other shield volcano on the island of Hualalai. So it's neat to be able to stand in one spot and see two of the volcanoes. I'm going to try and show this drone clip. We'll see if it plays in PowerPoint. If it doesn't, I will try to just stop sharing and play it outside. But the reason why I show this drone clip is just to provide more context of what the property looks like. So thumbs up if it's playing. Kind of, maybe just really choppy. It's providing some context to the property that works. But that video and I guess this next video are both facing Makai, so towards the ocean is straight ahead. Behind us is the mountain. And this property, again, up until 2018 was being grazed by cattle. And they just have really ambitious reforestation goals with most, if not all of this grass area being planted with native forest species. So there's extensive projects going on all year. There's something to do on this property. In the same area that drone footage was taken, we can see 3 different planting years of native forest species. So in this photo, we can see 2018, 2019, and 2020 tree plantings. I took this photo last summer, so we don't have the 2021 plantings, but this whole like lower left side of the photo is all planted at this point. The trees grow so fast here. The plant growth rate is a definite perk to year-long growing conditions. Because it is a dry forest, the plants slow down during the dry season, but not to the extent of like plants in temperate ecosystems where they really slow their growth or sometimes they go dormant. For this property and just dry forest, there are so many native plants that we can put back on the landscape. This property, they primarily plant a mixture of 10 species. They're species that are more commonly available and they can just handle outplantings really well. But they do supplement with other native plants to increase the diversity. The caption for this photo I put in my notes is just fencing, fencing, fencing. And the amount of times we discuss fencing in the relationship of forest restoration in Hawaii makes me think of the realtor saying location, location, location. And that's because forest restoration work in Hawaii, the #1 step is fencing. Hawaii's landscape has been heavily modified. Hawaii is known as a biodiversity hotspot in the world. And unfortunately, because of these modifications, it's also known as an invasive species capital and an extinction capital of the world. There's invasive species from plants to animals. Some of the invasive species are ungulates, which are mammals like cattle, goats, sheep, pigs, and they heavily graze plants. And for some reason, they really love native plants. So that is problematic and why we really need to have fencing. And just a fun fact, there are only 2 native mammals in Hawaii, and only one primarily lives on land, and that's the Hawaiian hoary bat, and it is not an ungulate. So fencing needs to happen so the plants don't get immediately eaten after planting, and then also really give them a chance to establish after planting and put on some good growth. Don't leave gates open like this photo. That's how big animals like this cow can get in. This is an example of a really nice fence with like wooden and stone work. Most of the property has fence that looks like this. It's just a more simple metal fence, but it's still very effective at keeping out the range of ungulates that we need to keep out. The next step, once you fence, can be planting. And personally, this is my favorite part. This is a series of 3 photos with Kairos, who helped me out with planting one of my research plots. But he's just demonstrating the different steps that we take to prepare an area and then plant seedlings. I've planted seedlings and trees around the world in many different ecosystems. And I think it's really neat to see the different tools people use and kind of compare and contrast, because there's definitely some similarities. And there's also differences that are like fine-tuned to the landscape that we're working in. Before Hawaii, I had never tried to plant in or around lava rock, but it's pretty brutal to try to find planting areas. But in the second photo, you can see Kairos using an o'o bar, which is just like a thick, heavy metal bar. And it makes getting into like lava areas, like little cracks in the lava and the lava rock, a little bit easier. In venturing through other parts of the property, there are a few remnant forested areas where we can see more of the native plants that are part of the ecosystem we're trying to bring back. On the left, I'm highlighting kupu kupu, which is a fern, and I really like using that fern when making lei. And on the right, and I guess actually in both photos, we have ohia lehua, which is the tree in both photos. Ohia lehua is really neat. I think so many trees are super neat. Ohia is pretty special because it can colonize lava fields like immediately. So there'll be like some fern, some moss, and then an ohia lehua tree, which I think is fascinating. And it's also part of like climax forests that are super wet and mature. And the dominant tree is ohia lehua. So it really covers like the 2 extreme ends of ecological succession and like all the different parts of succession in the middle. Wondering if you all could like think to yourself why this tree could look this way. So I'll give a little overview too, that like ohia lehua look like this across the property and across properties where they have like really interesting root system that's above ground. So let's give a few moments for you to think maybe what could be explaining that. I see some maybe thoughts going on. The answer is that ohia lehua germinate very well on fallen logs. So when a tree falls in the forest, it starts to decay and can really provide great microhabitats for little plants to come and grow. So in this case, if you can just picture a big log, like right here at the base of the tree, and a little ohia lehua seed falling onto that log, germinating, growing, going through the log, and then because the log had already fallen and started decomposing, it'll eventually erode away, leaving the root system to look like this that the ohia lehua had grown through. And it's kind of like an echo of its beginnings. Staying on the ohia lehua train, we have a native vine that wraps itself primarily around ohia lehua. It's called ie ie, and I think it is just one of the most beautiful vines. And I absolutely love their flowers. They're this beautiful coral color. Some are a bit more orange or red. They flower a lot in the summertime, but occasionally you'll see one throughout other parts of the year. And it's just nice to see like that pop of color amongst like a dominant green landscape. Another native plant that is quite prevalent in like the remnant areas here is the hapu'u, or the Hawaiian tree fern. There's also Australian and New Zealand tree ferns, but the way you can distinguish the hapu'u, the Hawaiian tree fern, from the others is this wool-like hair at the base of the fronds. It's called pulu, and pulu can be harvested and used as like a stuffing or just like a really soft material. And it used to really be used for like pillows. So there used to be like pulu factories to collect and like process pulu. Alongside Ohia lehua as a dominant Hawaiian forestry species is koa. Koa is very fast growing. It's in the bean family, and it is used for fine wood working, from guitars and furniture, bowls, to really large traditional Hawaiian voyaging canoes. A little shout out to the canoes from Moana. They would have been traditionally, like the Hawaiian voyaging canoes would have been traditionally made out of koa. A few organisms that rely on koa are koa bugs and umikoa. Umikoa is a type of lichen on the right. I could go on and on about plants. And since I know this about myself, I try to include other organisms that are in the ecosystems. So I think koa bugs are so cute. For scale, the koa bugs are on a seed pod. So it's about the width of my thumb. So they're just these like really cute little tiny bugs that develop into this larger koa bug. And for anybody who loves insects out there, they are a true bug. And then the lichen on the right, the umikoa, I just think they're really fascinating organisms because they're made up of both algae and fungi, which I think is so cool that they can like create a composite organism like that. I'm going to give you all a chance to spot the pueo in the left photo. Pueo is the Hawaiian hawk. So in the afternoons, really regularly, the clouds come in and create like this gray landscape. These photos are both from the same area as the drone footage. So morning to afternoon, the conditions can quickly change. And in the wet season, it's like heavy rains will come in the afternoon. But in the dry season, it's mostly just like the cloud cover. So if anybody's seen the pueo yet or hasn't, it's outlined in the orange. They are just like a really interesting owl. They're active during the day, and they are making a comeback, which is nice to see. Making a comeback, I should say, on this island. They're struggling a little bit still on the other islands. I also see some other birds like the Hawaiian hawk and some of the Hawaiian honey creepers that are pretty well known. And on the right, I am not a geologist or volcanologist. We fondly call the formations on the property, though, that look like this as blisters, specifically pahoehoe blisters. Pahoehoe is one type of lava, and we call it a blister because it's like 3-4 feet thick of lava that pressure built up and burst through. So that formation's like probably 7 feet tall, and like you have some chunks of lava that are like that wide, and you can kind of like peer in and see some more lava underneath. But back to plants. I have both field and nursery experiments that I get to conduct. Having the field experiments is great because, you know, that's what's going on. That's where the plants are being put. That's where we're trying to have them grow. But nursery experiments or even greenhouse experiments are really nice to have as a complement because it's a more controlled environment where, you know, we know how much water the plants are getting, how much light they're getting, how much nutrients they're receiving from fertilizer. So some of my projects happen in this plant nursery. It was started at the same time the property was purchased in 2018, and now it's the largest native plant nursery on island, and one of the largest, if not the largest, across Hawaii. A few of the other native plants that are grown in the nursery than the ones I've already shared about are mamane, kolea, and a'ali'i. And these 3 species are part of that like mixture of 10 that are commonly planted on site for restoration work. And something that I've learned that I didn't quite understand before moving to Hawaii was how important our relationship with these plants are, and how important our relationships with the plants are to the greater goal of restoration. I knew the importance of plants. I love plants, but I didn't understand like how knowing the plants well and having a relationship with them can impact the restoration work. And part of that relationship is knowing their name and their history. So where I did my undergrad and my master's for plant ID classes, we would learn the English name, like the common name, and the scientific name. But in Hawaii, for my plant ID class, I needed to learn 3 names. I needed to learn the Hawaiian, the English, and the scientific. And while that was hard to have like another name to keep track of, it's really helpful now. And I'm really appreciative of my professor who had us do that, because knowing the Hawaiian name, there's so much information that we can learn about the plants just in its name itself. The slides I've shown so far are just a few of the native species that are shown on property. This species is Iliahi, and this is like the plant that's at the heart of this property and at the heart of what I get to do during my PhD work. Along the lines of the importance of relationships between humans and plants is relationships between plants and other plants. Iliahi has a very unique relationship. It has a plant relationship I didn't know even existed. And it's highlighted in the photo on the right. And outlined in orange is a really specialized organelle that Iliahi has in its roots, so it can physically connect to the roots of other plants. And this unique relationship it kind of adds a curveball to any forestry question or ecology question we would ask, because oftentimes the questions and the projects that have happened don't think about plants that could actually connect to roots directly themselves. We have brainstormed many silly relationship project titles like 5 signs to know your Iliahi relationship is struggling, or 10 ways to improve your Iliahi relationship. And we think about Iliahi's relationship with other plants constantly. Unfortunately, Iliahi has been heavily harvested and exploited. It's a sandalwood, so another name for it is Hawaiian sandalwood. Some of you may be familiar with sandalwood, most likely like the Indian sandalwood, used a lot in religious and cultural ceremonies, making of mala beads, incense, essential oil. And because of that history and value, sandalwoods everywhere were heavily harvested, including the Hawaiian sandalwood or Iliahi. So part of the project and why it's at the heart of the work being done on the property is to bring it back and to have a future sustainable source of Iliahi. The threats to Iliahi continue, not just over harvesting and exploitation, but our cattle, the sheep, the pigs, they all pose threats to young seedlings and saplings of Iliahi. But as adults, one threat are rats. Iliahi have really fatty, delicious seeds, and rats will just go to town, which means there aren't seeds for the next generation of Iliahi. So one technique is to wrap a metal guard around the tree to protect the seeds from rats, because rats will just climb up the tree and eat them even before they drop to the ground. And when considering the future of any plant, knowing when it flowers and sets seeds is important for its future growth and development. On the left is an orange circle around a flower bud, and they eventually will flower like on the right. And there's actually 6 species of Iliahi in Hawaii. Half are part of this group that has like a pink red flower, and the other half have yellow, like creamy flowers. So they're just, again, kind of like the EAEA, like a nice pop of color in the forest, especially the pink ones. Because of its unique relationship with other plants, sometimes you'll see Iliahi that look like this one. It's outlined in orange on the right, growing really close to a host plant. We have some experiments to figure out like best practices. So how close should they be planted? How far apart? Are there certain native plants that it grows better with? Or there's some that they don't grow well with? Like that relationship is really hard to form with certain species. So they're just a few of the questions that we're trying to ask in the field and greenhouse studies. And lastly, here is a truck full of Iliahi seedlings ready to be planted. We typically plant when they're 10 months old. So you have to plan, I guess like for temperate species, we're used to planning on a pretty long outgrowing of seedlings, but some other Hawaiian species, they only need to grow for like 2 months and then they're ready to be planted. So for Iliahi, we need to think a bit more long-term with planting and growing them in the nursery. And then they'll be ready to go. And hopefully with a little TLC, they'll make it to be large trees that will set seed and start the next generation of seedlings. So I want to quickly acknowledge all the people who are part of the project, the property that I get to work on, the advisors and lab mates, funders. Excuse me, it takes a team effort, and just mahalo nui. Thank you very much. Feel free to ask questions now. If you'd rather email me, I have my email listed up here. And hey Maoni now, any questions?
Thank you so much, Emily. That was a lovely talk and really great to hear insights about your study and about your field sites. I know I have some questions, but I will open it up to our audience. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question directly, type it in the chat. Up to you. I'm actually, you know what? I'll start it off. I don't see any questions yet or hands raised. Tell me more about these blisters, the pohoihoi. Do those just emerge sometimes, or was that like, are they very old?
They're old. Those are when those form when the lava is like still fresh. Again, I don't know much about lava, but I do know that I do think those, it's not like when it's like red hot lava, it's when it's like cooler and then there's still pressure building and then they go.
Thanks for sharing.
But I couldn't imagine seeing that happen. That would be wild.
I have to admit, I got a little worried about you in the field. Like, is she gonna be affected by one of these?
Yeah, there's things that you have to think about with field work there that you never would have thought. Like, I bring my dog to the field with me a lot. He's just like this small little thing, and there's lots of lava tubes, which are like, they're a tube. It's a tube of lava that it used to be like a kind of like a river flowing of lava, but they're all over the property. So you just have to be careful where you walk. And like, he hasn't fallen in one yet, but I keep a close eye on him.
That's probably good. So we do have a question in the chat. Rich asks, are the cows and sheep feral?
Yes. The cow and sheep, well, yes and no is a better answer to that question. There are feral cow and sheep, and then there are some that belong to properties. I don't know like what the legal books say, but the culture in Hawaii is that you fence to keep animals out. You don't fence to keep your own animals in. So Typically, I see feral animals that don't have tags on them, but I know a friend who works on another property. They know who the owner is, and they can see the tags on like the cow's ears. So both.
Thanks, Emily. Maria, looks like Maria has a question.
Yeah, Emily, if you don't mind, I know you and I have talked a fair bit about the role that Hawaiian language and culture has played in your experience of doing research there. Would you mind sharing a little bit about sort of what your experience has been like coming from maybe more of like Western perspectives, and then just learning like different ways of knowing and just learning alongside and trying to be as respectful as possible and learn as much as possible from the culture?
Yeah, did not think when I signed up for a PhD program that I'd be learning a new language. And here I am, I take weekly classes. So the property I work on, there's a cultural consultant, and she is just fantastic teacher. She used to be a principal at a Hawaiian immersion school. So language is her life. She just gets excited when anyone's interested to learn. And so she is the one who kind of nudged me the most to start learning Hawaiian. But right off the bat, like all of our introductory courses and kind of like graduate student orientation, they talked about how important the Hawaiian language is, and bringing it back, because it was really close to going away and kind of becoming extinct in the 60s and 70s. And then in the 70s, there was this big cultural renaissance that was happening where the language made a big comeback. And because of that, it's just still increasing in how common people use the language. So I first started learning with her, and now I'm taking weekly classes with parents. So I work with the immersion school nearby. So the immersion school, they only speak Hawaiian. Like K through 3, they only instruct in Hawaiian. And then as the students get older, they start to have some English and Hawaiian instruction side by side. So because I work with them and I'm connected with them, the parents asked if I wanted to join their language class. So now weekly I take class with the parents. And I say that my dog's my kid that attends the school. And it's been an honor to learn. I do feel like I'm cautious about walking the line of like cultural appreciation and then cultural appropriation. And I have conversations with people like on a fairly regular basis about that, just because I think having conversations is one way you can keep yourself in check and kind of keep being intentional with what you're doing. And yeah, it's a beautiful language. And if anyone's interested in learning Hawaiian or any indigenous language, like whether it's the region that you're originally from or the place you're currently living and working, I think there's a lot that we could learn from an indigenous language.
We've got another question in the chat from Tess. What kind of research or work do you want to do? I assume like in the future, maybe after your PhD?
Anything with plants. I specifically trees, any plant I would be happy to work with, but trees I really love trees, learning about trees and how they grow and develop. And I really enjoy working in the idea, or like I guess in the more specific area of restoration work, and how we can help facilitate forests and trees in the future. So that is what I would love to do. I also really enjoy working with students and peers. So would love to be able to teach in some capacity. Doesn't have to be like a traditional classroom, but get to talk and teach, and then also learn from people, because I feel like as you're teaching, you learn so much as well.
I had a question that came directly to me. It says, after grad school, are you interested in staying in Hawaii, or will you move back stateside?
really tough question. um, I don't know. I don't know. I love Hawaii, and if I were able to, I don't know, cut the flight from 5 hours to an hour down to see family, I absolutely would stay here. But I think the being far away from family is the one thing that would pull me from Hawaii. But if that does happen, I would still love to stay connected to the people and the property. And because that's part of forestry work and working with trees is you got to be in it for the long haul. Or I want to be in it for the long haul because the trees are. So all the projects that I've been a part of, I try to try to stay connected because we can learn a lot when we first plant the trees, and that's like the early stages of their development. But as they grow and as the area develops, there's so much more to learn from them in the future.
When you're planting those 10-month-old trees, so I know you mentioned it's quite a bit of planning ahead of time until they're old enough to move out into the forested area. Are there like, and this is completely out of ignorance for other habitat types outside of my temperate zone, are there like specific weather conditions, specific seasons that are great for seedlings that age? Or do you have to make sure that you're timing not only like the age of the seedlings, but different aspects of seasonality as well?
Yeah, absolutely. At this property, so we call it like an outplanting window, and the outplanting window is just like the ideal time of year to plant the seedlings or to put plants in the ground. And because it is a dry forest system, we want to plant during the wet season. Most of Hawaii's wet season is comparable to temperate winter, but Kona's special and the wet season is actually opposite. So our wet season in Kona is like April to November. So that's when planting happens. So the nursery, they need to time it so they have 10-month-old seedlings that are ready to get planted between April and November.
And we had another question. Where the soil might have cooled with a lot of lava in it, does that make a difference for when you're growing plants? I guess I don't know a lot about growing plants in volcanic areas.
Yeah, volcanic soil can be really rich, and it can also be really more devoid of nutrients. It kind of depends on where in the aging stage it is. Hawaii, like so how I mentioned, there's like all these different life zones in Hawaii. There's all these different soils in Hawaii too. So the older the island, the more soil types they have, which is really neat. And all I can remember right now for like a state to compare it to is Illinois. And I think Illinois has like 3 soil types. And like most of the Midwest, there's like 1 or 2 soil types, and Hawaii has 8 or 9, I think, out of like 13 or so. So there's just like a ton of different soils in Hawaii that are all from like essentially the same, it is the same hot spot where the lava comes. It's just like the islands have moved over the hot spot. So I don't know about like cooling, like how the cooling of lava plays into that, but I imagine like the depth of lava does. So like the deeper the lava, probably the longer it takes to break down and become a really nutritious soil. I mentioned pahoehoe because that was like the type of blister. It's pahoehoe is a really smooth lava. And then there's also a'a, which is like more spiked, I guess, like they're like spiky lava. So a'a is the name, and we say to remember that. It's if you stepped on it, you would say ah. So a'a is like already broken up more, whereas pahoehoe is kind of like a sidewalk. So I bet you a'a lava decomposes or like it develops faster than Pahoehoe. And I know the difference in the lava, it has to do with the temperature. So that might has to play into cooling of it. That's all I know about lava. That's the extent of lava and soil.
There was another question. Someone wondered if there are wine grapes grown in Hawaii, perhaps in your area.
Yeah. I don't know of a crop that can't grow in Hawaii. So there's like everything, especially on this island and on the Kona side where I'm at. It's like the agriculture area. So like there's avocado trees everywhere, and there are lemon trees and lychee and mango and all sorts of crops that are kind of more like growing on their own. And there's some that are more of like a traditional farm that are like well maintained. There's, to my knowledge, only one like purposefully grown vineyard. And it's actually close to Volcano, which is where Kilauea is, that the currently erupting volcano. But I don't know what type of grapes they are, but they do grow here. And then I've just seen lots of grapes just growing on their own. And they're kind of a side note to the grape. This goes back to like place names and the importance of like language. There's a street on the other island, Oahu, where Honolulu is, that's called Vineyard, and it intersects with another street, and I cannot remember the name of it, but it's Hawaiian for grape. So there's Vineyard Boulevard and there's the Grape Street, basically. And where they like kind of intersect, there used to be a vineyard that one of the Hawaiian kings had started. So it's not there anymore. It used to be. Great. So grapes can grow here.
Thanks for sharing those trivia facts. Any other questions? Bill, did you have a question?
I have a question. That I'm not Virginia. I'm Nick. I'm over at Virginia's place. Thanks so much. In the lower 48, there's a lot of indigenous stewardship of the land that's becoming a little bit more. We're paying a little bit more attention to it. I don't know if we missed the beginning of your talk. I don't know if you talked about indigenous stewardship of the land, but is that something that you've had exposure to in your time over in Hawaii?
Yeah, I absolutely have. I think I've had the most exposure in Hawaii than anywhere else I've lived. And I'm not sure if that is my interest in it and like kind of seeking it out, or just being more common. I'm gonna guess it's probably a combination of the both. But they're kind of along with the revival of the Hawaiian language in the 70s, that spurred just revival of all pieces of the culture. Currently, there's really big efforts for food sovereignty. So there's a lot of conversations happening with indigenous knowledge as it relates to agriculture. As far as like trees are involved, it's a lot of agroforestry conversations. And like I don't know if I think this is an earlier question, but we have a cultural consultant on the property, and her big goal is to work on weaving Western like approaches to scientific knowledge and then traditional ecological knowledge. And she uses the term weaving intentionally because she's concerned about the term like blending or combining, because she thinks like they should stand alone and like be what they are, and then they can also come together and complement each other, but not necessarily get like combined and then the essence of one or the other would be lost. And she actually uses a term that refers to a mat that we hula on, and you like have that mat and it's just a tightly weaved like plant fibers. And so that's the specific like Hawaiian term she uses, is how we would weave together that hula mat, as how she would love to see like the different ways of knowing being incorporated into the work happening on the property.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of reminded me of your question earlier, and it made me think, I'm not sure if you all have heard of two-eyed seeing, but it's a concept that comes from Canadian First Nations. And it's an idea, and again, like I learned about this in Hawaii, and so I don't know if it's just the timing of things or just there being more scholarship around those concepts in Hawaii. But for two-eyed seeing, it's a concept of having like two lenses to glasses and viewing our world through two different lenses and like kind of two different ways of knowing. And in that context, being the First Nations way of knowing, and then the more dominant Western way of knowing.
I hadn't heard that. I'm gonna have to look that up.
Yeah, two-eyed seeing.
Yeah, I'll have to look that up indeed. Did anyone else have any questions for Emily before we wrap up for the year? Because this is our last Biophilia of the year. My goodness, what happened? I have a fun question for you before we head out. What is something that you have experienced in Hawaii, whether it's food or an aspect of the culture, or even just a fantastic day at the beach? What's just your favorite thing that you've picked up while you're there, just for fun, or just enjoyed while you're there?
I've gotten a lot more comfortable in the ocean, and I really love that. When moving here, people, I don't know if it was like a out of concern or out of like what, but people would be like, don't get island fever. I'm like, what? And it's like the concept of like cabin fever in the winter, like island fever, like you get like tired of being on an island, like a small island in the ocean. I've yet to feel that. And one piece of advice I was given about that was like, think of the ocean as an extension of the island. And because that's how like my friends who are born and raised here, like that's how they think. Like it's not just the land, but it's the ocean too. So I've just gotten a lot more comfortable in the ocean than I've ever been before. So I swim a lot and I paddle, and that's something fun.
Awesome.
That's a great perspective.
Much.
All right. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you again, Emily. That was a really interesting, really insightful talk. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you have a great December. I hope your holidays are wonderful. And we will see you here again in January. Have a good night, everybody.